Grr. Oh, it's actually recording. Never mind. Okay. All right, so guys, please do remember that we are recording, so we don't want to hear you goofing off in the background or anything. So we're going to start watercolors. I know some of you are not done glazing, and that is okay because we're going to work on both at the same time. There are a lot of times with watercolor where you have to let it dry, and we do have a couple hair dryers for those who are ready to get it done and move on, but if you're still glazing while it's drying, you can take that time to work on your glazing a little bit. This watercolor is all about building up in layers. Couple things that I think might be a little different than what Miss Lawson did. I know that sometimes she and I do things differently, which is normal. It just means we got probably taught a little differently. One of my big rules is, in this watercolor palette, 99% of the time you will not be taking color straight out of that palette and putting it on your paper. Because of two reasons. Number one, it is too hard to get a consistent color when you do that. Every time you dip in, you might have a little bit more or less water on your brush and your color is a little bit different. Number two, it's easier to mix colors when you're doing that and mess up the palette. So the only time really you will dip straight into the palette is if you're doing maybe some kind of thin outline that you need really dark. What was the other? Oh, number two, I know last year you guys had your own watercolor palettes, and when you mixed colors, you did it up here. Please do not do that. We are sharing these. We don't want colors mixed up here. You're going to use the mixing palettes to mix your colors. Okay? So, when you get your color, you're going to take a clean brush, dip it in the water, and you're going to squeeze some water into your mixing palette. How much you're going to put in there depends on how big of an area you need to cover. If you're covering a large area, you really want to fill it up pretty much, otherwise you're going to run out of the color, and it's hard to match colors once you run out of them, okay? I'm going to be doing a large area first, so I am going to pretty much fill this up. So the first thing I'm going to do on my paper, this is a practice project you guys are going to do before you do your real project. I'm going to do a flat wash. What is a flat wash? Okay, it's all color.
Yeah, there's no design.
No design. And what do we want specifically about the color? We want it to be even. Good. So for my background on this one, I think I'm going to do yellow. So I've got my water in my palette. I'm going to get my brush a little wet. I'm going to go into my yellow, soak my brush, and I'm going to move some of that into my palette. I'm going to keep doing that until I get my watercolor as dark as I want it. Obviously, if you want a darker color, you want more of the watercolor paint, less of the water. Okay, and you can test this on a scrap piece of paper or on a paper towel, because you're always going to want to have a paper towel handy. I have a scrap piece of paper here. I think I want it just a little darker. I'm going to get a little more. All right, now that I have my color mixed up, I'm going to do my flat wash, and like Stephanie said, I'm trying to get even color. And this is a background. I'm going to cover the whole thing. A lot of times when you start a watercolor, you're going to start with flat washes. They might not all be one color. If I was doing like a meadow and a sky, I would probably do a flat wash of blue and a flat wash of green. For this, it's just a background. I'm going to do the yellow. And I'm just doing even strokes back and forth. I still do not think that is quite dark enough. I'm going to add, probably shouldn't have picked yellow. That's a but I wanted kind of a light color for what we're doing. All right, that's a little better. So I'm just doing nice side to side motion, trying not to puddle the water, it's not too wet. Your paper is gonna bubble some when you're doing watercolor. Really the only way to avoid that is by using a very high quality paper, which is very heavy and thick and costs about $5 per sheet of paper. So obviously we are not using that. You can also stretch your paper. That's a long process. We did some experimenting with it in our upper level art class, and it is a lot harder than it looks. So when you're working on your painting, if it gets super bubbly and you want to flatten it before you do another part, we do have an iron. We can flip it over in a towel and iron it. All right, so that's my flat wash. You can see, well, it's hard to see, but it's consistent throughout. I do have a, when I do my tape, I tend to find some of my German Shepherd hairs on my clothing. So, all right, so I've got my flat wash. The next thing I need to do before I can move on, I don't want to do a wet on wet, so this needs to be dry first, okay? I could use the hair dryer, but I actually started one earlier, so I'm just gonna switch them out. And I can use this one for my next class because it'll be dry. This has a different color background, but that's okay. So your practice, where'd you go? Why did it turn off?
You just sent it to the left.
Did I unplug it somehow? You heard something pop? Well, this is great.
I'll take some powder.
Oh, wait, maybe that was it.
That's delicious.
Yeah, maybe it. I don't know why it did that. So give me just 1 second, guys. Gotta love technical issues, right? Well, while it's loading, we can talk about the next technique. Actually, go ahead and put that away for me right now, okay? I know. Our next technique is going to be dry on dry. All right, or wet on dry, I'm sorry. So your practice is going to be ice cream cones, something not too hard. Your real project will be a little more exciting, but this is just something to kind of practice our techniques. So I started this one over here. You can sketch when you do watercolor, but if you do, it has to be like the lightest sketch of your life because watercolors don't always cover that pencil really well, all right? So you're gonna do 3 ice cream cones next to each other. Each ice cream cone is gonna have 3 scoops, which as you can see means I started this one way too high. So you can learn that from me. I grabbed this white crayon. It's not gonna work on this because I've already done my flat wash. You need something to stay white on your watercolor. Even though you have white watercolor paint, that's not gonna turn it white. That white is more to mix with other colors to get lighter versions of them. The only way to do white is to not paint it at all, which is hard. Or you can use a white crayon and mark those white areas, and then that part of the paper won't take in the watercolor. So if you have like a really white highlight on something or some snow that's really white, you wanna use a white crayon first. But I can't do that because I already did my flat wash. So I need to mix some brown, just like I did with the yellow. Always make sure you are starting with a clean brush. Paper towels. And the way you check your brush to make sure it's clean is after you rinse it, you touch it to your paper towel and make sure no color comes off of it. Pretty easy. So I'm going to, I don't need quite as much of the brown as I did the yellow. Mix that in there, and to get my brown, I'm going to use a smaller brush this time. Pick up that brown. And I'm actually going to start with it kind of lighter like that. In my first layer, I don't want it quite as dark. I am going to learn from my mistake and make this one a little lower. I'm going to get my shape of my ice cream cone. Put in there. We have lots of different brushes you can use. Some people with lines are comfortable with smaller brushes. And then, all right. So I'm going to do a wet on dry now. Still kind of a flat wash. I can have some variations though, because as you know, we're gonna have shadows and things. Make it pretty consistent, and then if I want to lighten an area, I can kind of go in with my brush a little wet and pull some of that up. Again, we are working in layers, so quickly, this only takes a second. If you have watercolor pooled on top of whatever you're painting, make sure with the hairdryer you're pointing straight down, otherwise you're going to blow your color onto your paper. And you can tell when it's dry because then it's not shiny anymore. And I've only got one little area that's still a little wet. I'm gonna add some more brown to this now. And obviously if I was doing all 3 cones right now, I would have wanted to paint all 3 of my bases first, which would also help with them drying. I work left to right because I'm right-handed. And I'm just making this brown darker because I want to go in and I want to add some shadow areas on this side. Okay, and then I can kind of pat my brush. Blend those out a little bit. So I've got obviously my light here is coming more from the left, right? Because it's getting darker as we go. All right, just a couple more things to show you and you guys are gonna get started. I know this is kind of review, but whenever you haven't done something in a while, it's good to review. I'm gonna dry this. Again, trying to go straight down with my air so that I don't blow that watercolor all over my paper. And you can always, once it dries, you can go back in and add more dark areas to darken it even more if you want more shadow. But I'm trying to get through this for you guys, so These two little dots are still wet. All right. Almost done, I promise. So this is when we actually use our brush directly in the watercolor palette, because I'm gonna do my lines for my cone. So I want my brown very dark. Go in and pick it up straight out of the palette. And then I'm gonna go in and do my lines for my cone. Diagonal this way. And then diagonal this way. And then while you're in there, if you want to add just some final, this side is the darkest side. I'm going to darken up the edge and just kind of add a few darker low lights. I can do that. All right. Last thing, and then I'm setting you free. For your ice cream cones, you are going to do a wet on wet. Wet on wet causes the paints to blend into each other. So I'm going to use my paintbrush, which is clean. I'm going to get it wet. You got to make sure your water is clean when you do this. Mine doesn't look too bad. And I'm going to draw with the water the shape of what my ice cream cone is going to be. Which I know sounds strange because I'm not putting any color on the paper yet. I just want to get that whole area where the ice cream is going to be damp. Okay. So now, when I go in with my color for my ice cream, which I should have mixed before I did my wet, because it's going to dry out a little bit, so I might have to. If I want to do this purple color, whatever this is, magenta maybe, then I can go in on this wet on wet. And the color spreads throughout the water. If the color isn't as dark as you wanted it to be, the answer is not adding more to here, it's making it darker in your palette. Because otherwise you're just gonna end up with a lot of puddling. So I can go in and do that. And then I can add another color to it to make it more interesting. When you're adding more colors, please remember the color wheel right here. Okay? When you're mixing colors together, you want them to be colors that are close together on the color wheel, which are analogous colors. If you use complementary colors across from each other, you are going to end up with ugly browns. Now I can go in and touch my blue. And I've got my ice cream cone. My 1 scoop. All right? So flat wash, wet on dry, and then wet on wet are our 3 techniques you guys are using. When you put your tape on your paper around the edge, make sure you're touching it to your clothes a few times first so it doesn't tear the paper when we take it off. And pick out any dog hairs that you might have attached to your clothing.